And I couldn't stop thinking about Wayne Jarvis, which is this like character from Arrested Development. Jarvis. So like anytime he would start talking about professionalism, like Wayne Jarvis would narrate that part of the book for me. Which is just, so Wayne Jarvis was this like, this attorney on the show. And he's just like, oh, I'm a professional. And like, he would always say this of like why he would or would not do something. And so it just made me think of this because really, I don't know, you should check out some clips on that. Maybe we can put it in the show notes. It's really,
and if you
really
haven't
funny.
watched Arrested Development, there's about an 80% chance this podcast turns into an Arrested Development rewatch podcast when we run out of software engineering books. So,
Yes,
you can get ahead of that. Hey everyone, welcome to Book Overflow. This is the podcast for software engineers by software engineers dedicated to reading the best technical books in the world in an effort to improve our craft. I am Carter Morgan, and I'm joined here as always by my co-host Nathan Toups. How are you doing, Nathan?
Doing great. Hey everybody.
Great. Well, we are excited this week. A couple housekeeping notes right at the top. Please, if you're watching us on YouTube, like, comment, subscribe, just engage with the podcast. It really helps us out, boosts us in the algorithm. If you're following on Spotify or anywhere you can leave a rating, leave a 5-star rating. It's a big help. And follow us on that platform too. We keep track of our followers pretty diligently. And we also respond to our YouTube comments. So if you want to engage with this podcast in any way, leave a comment. We love hearing from you. And another great announcement, our interview with Mark Richards, the author of Fundamentals of Software Architecture, is live. Nathan, how was that experience, do you think?
Yeah, that was a lot of fun. I think that Mark Richards being just the beginning of a really cool pattern where we're going to start reaching out and talking to the authors to dive in deeper to the subject matter. So again, if you have comments in the videos, we'd love to relay those over to the authors as well. So if you see something, you have additional questions or want deeper insights, take that opportunity and we'll try to give you a voice.
Absolutely. We are not count your chickens before they hatch people, but we can say that we have some exciting things working through the pipelines. And that we can confidently say that Mark Richards is just the beginning, like Nathan alluded to. So please, if you're liking our discussions of the book, please keep following along. We love it. But also, we are really excited about this Mark Richards interview. It was such a blast to sit down and talk to him about reading the book. And we also got an exclusive scoop about what's to come, but we'll leave that as a hint and a reason to check out the actual interview. Well, we are so excited about the direction this podcast is taking. It's been such a blast doing it, and we are excited about the book this week. This week, we read The Clean Coder, a Code of Conduct for Professional Programmers. And this is by Robert C. Martin, colloquially known as Uncle Bob. Let's do a quick author introduction on Uncle Bob. He is, Nathan, would you say he's one of the most famous names in kind of the software engineering publishing milieu?
Yeah, his name definitely comes up a lot, and his strong opinions also come up a lot.
Yes. So background on him, Robert Cecil Martin, colloquially called Uncle Bob, is an American software engineer, instructor, and author. He is most recognized for promoting many software design principles and for being an author and signatory of the influential Agile Manifesto. He's authored many books and magazines. He was the editor-in-chief of C++ Report magazine, first chairman of the Agile Alliance. We learned this in the book, but he joined the industry at 17 and is self-taught, no college for Uncle Bob. And he is most famously known as the author of Clean Code, a handbook of agile software craftsmanship. Now, we should mention off the top, we did not read Clean Code. We read Clean Coder, which is different. And I'll give a summary of the book. This is the Amazon blurb. Programmers who endure and succeed amidst swirling uncertainty and nonstop pressure share a common attribute. They care deeply about the practice of creating software. They treat it as a craft. They are professionals. In The Clean Coder, a code of conduct for professional programmers, legendary software expert Robert C. Martin introduces the disciplines, techniques, tools, and practices of true software craftsmanship. The book is packed with practical advice about everything from estimating and coding to refactoring and testing. It covers much more than techniques and is about attitude. Martin shows how to approach software development with honor, self-respect, and pride, work well and work clean, communicate and estimate faithfully, face difficult decisions with clarity and honesty, and understand that deep knowledge comes with a responsibility to act. Lots of great stuff in this book, lots of hot takes we'll discuss. But Nathan, what were your general thoughts on the book?
This is the most extensive set of general thoughts I had on any book. And so I'm happy to hop on this. First of all, I wanted to say I found this book really entertaining. So it was fun to read.
Agreed.
There's lots of anecdotal stories. The history of his software engineering goes all the way back to like PDP 8 days, which I know of these machines, but I've actually never seen one. And I'm pretty sure it was the PDP 11 that like Unix was first created on. It was one of the PDP machines. So yeah, back in the day, pretty cool. The book provides a lot of solid advice from a seasoned pro. And I think there's this air of authority that he's coming from. And a lot of it is here's this mistake I made, here's this character arc, and here's a way that you can act as professional. I thought that was it's a clever pattern, and it's one that's really engaging. I do fear if you read this book really early in your career, you could take it as gospel. And that if you take this with advice without nuance, you may not understand and appreciate where he came from. Some of his attitudes were really bad early in his career, and he is sort of healing from this process. Other folks may not struggle with that. And so if you just take prescriptively what he's telling you to do, it might be an overcompensation for your personality type, things like this. My other hot take is that this is the CrossFit of programming styles.
Did me this earlier in the week, and it cracked me up.
Yeah. So I did CrossFit for years. So I mean this in a loving way, but it's sort of like people who are into CrossFit or veganism or anything. It's like, do you know programmers who are into clean code? Don't worry, they'll tell you, right? So it's that it's one of those things where as soon as you start hearing somebody obsess about clean code, it's probably because they just read some Uncle Bob stuff. So I had a half smirk on my face when I was coming across some of these things, but I still thought there's a nugget of wisdom and truth to every piece of advice, even if I maybe rolled my eyes a little bit at some of it. The other one was the book's obsessed with professionalism, which again, it's in the title or the subtitle at least. And I couldn't stop thinking about Wayne Jarvis, which is this character from Arrested Development. Jarvis. So anytime he would start talking about professionalism, Wayne Jarvis would narrate that part of the book for me. Which is just, so Wayne Jarvis was this attorney on the show, and he's just oh, I'm a professional. And he would always say this of why he would or would not do something. And so it just made me think of this because really, I don't know, you should check out some clips on that. Maybe we can put it in the show notes. It's really,
and if
really
you haven't watched Arrested Development, there's about an 80% chance this podcast turns into an Arrested Development rewatch podcast when we run out of software engineering books. So, you can get ahead of that.
There's dozens of us. So he made, and then he also, one of the most interesting hot takes that I found in the book was I'm obsessed with Csikszentmihalyi and the idea of flow. That's where this whole focus on flow and creativity. He also calls it getting in the zone. And he makes a case against spending too much time in flow. And I'd never heard of this hot take before. And it kind of knocked me aback a bit. And I had to really think about where he was coming from here. I went from a visceral reaction against this idea to being okay, I see where he's coming from. So anyway, those are my general thoughts. I'm sure we'll bring them up when we get into specifics, but yeah, it made me think a lot. I'll say that.
Your final point about how it kind of took you aback and you being I've never heard this take before is how I felt about a lot of the book, and not necessarily in a bad way, but yeah, it's kind of filled with, like I said, hot takes. I totally agree that it's a very engaging book, which is great because obviously we're reading a lot of books in this podcast. And I like to strike a balance between when are we reading kind of deeper technical readings, and then when are we reading something that's a little more autobiographical or more like a novel. So this one definitely falls in the autobiographical section. And it was delightful. I mean, it was an easy read. Again, do I agree with everything that was written in it? Probably not. But super fun read. It serves as a semi-biography of Bob Martin's career, which is really cool. And I also think it's really cool to get an older engineer's perspective. There aren't many older engineers in this field. Part of that can be ageism, but another part of it is just that it's a growing field. And so there's always going to be more younger engineers than older engineers. So this really did feel like having a crotchety old coworker who you can sit down at lunch with and get his take on this or that, or the mistakes he's made in his career, why he's adopted the philosophies he's adopted. And to hear it from someone who is as high performing and successful as Bob Martin, it's a treat. Again, is it the gospel truth? No, probably not. But it is someone's perspective. And I did appreciate that. Like I said, tons of personal stories. It makes for a very engaging read. Despite being pretty intense, it's also pretty grounded. Like the whole thing isn't just platitude after platitude. It's usually a platitude followed with some very specific advice on how you could implement that platitude in your career. So I thought that was really helpful. And I also found it in a way aspirational. He has a very high standard for himself and for others. And I don't know if I'm going to live up to that standard, but just seeing someone doing it, I don't know. And like inspiring is too heavy a word, but it's kind of like how people thought, what was it? Like a sub 2 hour marathon was impossible until someone did it. And then all of a sudden people started doing it. That's kind of how it feels reading this book. You might think that behaving this way is impossible or out of like, or too much, but seeing someone write a whole book about it, reading it, and just reading that it is a possibility, it kind of broke down that mental barrier in my mind of what my career could be. Do I want it to be exactly like this book? Probably not. But it opens up possibilities. So I thought that was really fun about the book. The main theme of the book is professionalism, right? I'll throw in another sitcom reference. In 30 Rock, there's an episode where one of the characters, Jenna Maroney, is trying to be like the spokesman for wool, like the like sheep make, but like her life is wool is a conservative industry, and she's kind of lives a crazy life, and they just say she's not wool enough. And but then when she will like do things that are, she's trying to impress them and do things that are like, conservative, they'll be like, that's very wool, Jenna. That's how I felt about this book. He talks about like, that's very professional. This is very not professional. The whole book is defined by what is or is not professional. And kind of to set up his thoughts on it, he had two really engaging stories at the beginning, one personal and then one well-known from the news. So the personal one, he talks about working on this team with, he's the tech manager. He kind of partners with the business manager, and they have to get this product delivered. It's a very time-sensitive due date. And so they work, they bust down doors, they do everything they can to get it done. And finally, they get it. It's ready to go across the finish line, but they need legal to like sign off on one more thing. He goes to his business partner and says, okay, great, let's go up to legal. Let's do our song and dance. Let's get this done one more time. But it's like a Friday afternoon. And his business partner says like, no, we're not going to go do that, even though they're supposed to go live. It's like, what are you talking about? He's like, legal. He's like, they're not going to have time to do it today. And Bob is like, well, they can do it over the weekend. He's like, no. He's like, if they could have done it, they would have done it already. These people are professionals, Bob. And Bob kind of paused and thought, well, I thought we were professionals, like the dev team. But then it sets up the book, and he says, he reflected on it. Maybe they weren't professionals. And he also starts the book with talking about the Challenger disaster. And the Challenger disaster kind of famously was caused by some malfunctioning O-rings, which the engineers knew about. And they went to management, and they kind of raised a big stink internally and said, we really shouldn't launch in the States. Too cold. The O-rings are going to malfunction. And Bob Martin kind of says, well, those engineers did the right things. They went to management. It's management's fault. And maybe that's what they tell themselves. They said, I wonder if any of them regret not calling Dan rather. And that sets up kind of the other side of what it means to be a professional. This idea that ultimately it's not management that's responsible for your career or the product you produce. It is you, and you're responsible for it and the consequences. Really fascinating and intense way to set up the book. Nathan, what are your thoughts on how he set up the book and just how he talks about professionalism in general?
Yeah. So I have some conflicting feelings here. I think that from like a taking personal responsibility and accountability, mastery, commitment, like these themes are really solid. It actually reminds me of what is it, Postel's law, which is be liberal with what you accept and conservative with what you send, in the sense that like hold yourself to a very high standard. And at the same time, understand that you can be responsive to a world that maybe doesn't hold themselves to that same standard, but that you can be this example and beacon. I think that's a really valuable thing. what I don't get, and I think maybe this is a generational divide, especially the Challenger thing. I've actually studied the Challenger bit a good bit, and my father actually is a retired military and spends a lot of time. He worked in the safety wing of the Air Force, and so this is a very famous story. And what's funny is the way that he framed the Challenger episode in this book is that like this ragtag team knew that there was some problem and that no one would listen to them, and it stopped. And that's not really what happened. It was actually a really interesting story about cascading failure in the sense that everyone's zone of responsibility was actually within an error band that was considered acceptable, but nobody had measured the system of an emergent disaster that would have come from all error bands cascading in their failure zones, meaning that a fundamental flaw can actually emerge from complex systems when every component is thought of as being healthy and okay. And I think this is an area that, maybe this is just a sign of the times. I'm a big fan of, for instance, blameless postmortems, right? The idea of a blameless postmortem isn't that somebody did push the button or write the code that actually broke the website. But why did the organization allow this to happen? And what's interesting is I consider a professional organization one that doesn't throw someone under the bus or put too much pressure on the very bottom rungs. And there wasn't an emphasis of that in this book. And I don't think that's what the purpose of this book was. The purpose of the book was, hey, you might be in an unprofessional environment. You might have all this pressure. You might have people asking you to give a lie about timelines, and you should hold yourself to this high standard. And I agree with that, but putting all of that on you and saying that, hey, if the organization fails, it's because you're the problem. That's the part where I was like, I don't know.
Yeah, I think the book very much deals with like a high internal locus of control. If you're not familiar with what that means, it's a concept in psychology which basically says how much you feel in control over yourself, right? And when bad things happen, are you blaming that on others? Or when you want to, let's say you want to get a new job, are you the type of person who says, okay, well, I'm going to study, I can improve my resume, I can send out, I can send out applications. There's a lot of things within my power to get this job. Or are you the kind of person who says, hey, getting a job is up to everyone else. There's not a ton I can do about it. So that's having a high internal locus of control. That's what this book is about. Like, it's very much not a book about organizations and systems, right? I actually have no idea what Uncle Bob's thought processes on, like you're saying, something like the Challenger disaster in total organizational failure. He's a consultant. And so I imagine he has feelings about how organizations work. But this book is very much, what can you do as a software engineer, as a professional, to be the best craftsman you can be? And so I think if you read this book, and I'm not accusing you of doing this, Nathan, I know we've been texting about it all week, but I think if you were to read this book and be like, this jerk doesn't know what he's talking about, he's, doesn't he know about this, doesn't he know about that? Like, you're not going to get a ton out of this book. But if you read this book and say, okay, what could I change from this book? There's a lot of great stuff in there. And that's kind of, what he says being a professional is all about.
I really do. I think that's really, to me, it's just, I see it as a continuum. And for instance, I wish there was a section here that was elaborated more on when to walk away, right? There are some environments in which you can't thrive, right?
Agreed.
Imagine being in a negotiation where your manager won't be reasonable. And we're going to talk about timelines and estimations. I've been in environments where you literally tell them this is how physics functions, and they're like, yeah, can you change physics?
Yeah. Well, so how does he define professionalism? He says, this book is about software professionalism. It contains a lot of pragmatic advice and an attempt to answer questions such as, what is a software professional? How does a software professional behave? How does a professional deal with conflict, tight schedules, unreasonable managers? When and how should a professional say no? How does a professional deal with pressure? And he goes on to say, professionalism is something that our profession is in dire need of. To me, a big takeaway from the book, I love Harry Truman, the president, had on his desk supposedly a sign that says the buck stops here. Basically, there's no one for the president to blame. He's the president. And I've tried to take that as kind of a personal philosophy in my life, that at some point the buck has to stop with someone, and it might as well stop with me. I think that kind of jives with the book, that there's a lot of specific advice about professionalism as the book goes on, but I think the core of the idea of professionalism is we are responsible for what we produce. we are responsible for our career. We are responsible for managing relationships with our coworkers. That doesn't fall to anyone else. And if we are responsible for it, then we should do it in a professional, standing, responsible way.
Yeah, I think you nailed it there. And that was my assessment as well. I will tell you that a lot of the stories of where he screws up and then, has the character arc where maybe I didn't hit the loads of the lows that he kind of describes, but I've definitely grown a lot in my professionalism and look back and go, yeah, I overpromised here, or I skirted around process, and he makes really compelling cases for never doing that, right? That if you say that something's going to happen, it needs to happen. And if you've identified that there's risk to the project, you should bring this up as soon as possible and renegotiate, and be as honest early in the process as possible. And that's just part of professionalism. I also, and we'll get into this later, I really love his focus on sort of these non-traditional aspects of, not necessarily getting a computer science degree, or the fact that like a mentorship or apprenticeship should actually be part of our profession. I love these ideas. And I think that they're well founded with this big, greater argument that he makes on professionalism in the book.
I loved it too. A little podcast lore for anyone who's interested. Nathan and I also came to this field untraditionally. Neither of us have a bachelor's in computer science. Nathan has since earned his master's in computer science, and I'm working my way through mine. Yes.
Yep.
So I felt some kinship with Uncle Bob in that.
Same.
We are going to talk a lot about his specifics. Nathan alluded to negotiation, how you can say no. There's a lot of great specific advice in this book. We're going to talk about all that and more after a quick break. And we are back. Thank you so much for tuning in. Okay, so we've talked a lot about professionalism. And if you've tuned in, you might be a little worried and think, this Uncle Bob, he's a workaholic. He's talking about how I got to sacrifice my personal life, my family, work 80 hours a week to be a professional. And that's not what he means. Again, the whole point of this book is taking responsibility. But a big part of taking responsibility is setting reasonable expectations. And so he has a whole chapter, it actually comes very early in the book, on saying no. Because being a professional doesn't mean you say yes to everything. This is how he phrases it. Professionals speak truth to power. Professionals have the courage to say no to their managers. How do you say no to your boss? After all, it's your boss. Aren't you supposed to do what your boss says? No, not if you are a professional. Slaves are not allowed to say no. Laborers may be hesitant to say no, but professionals are expected to say no. Indeed, good managers crave someone who has the guts to say no. It's the only way you can really get anything done. I thought this was a great way to kind of push back on what I think Uncle Bob knew we might all be thinking after reading the first bit of the book. What do you think, Nathan?
Yeah, I'm a people pleaser, and I'm like a recovering yesaholic. So this is something I've had. It's been long and painful in my career as to, my instinct is to be optimistic on my timelines. My instinct is to be accommodative, especially if you have like a charismatic leader in your organization. It's really easy to be like, yeah, you walk out of the meeting, you're like, yeah, I think I could pull this off. And then you're like, wait a second, don't be a hero, right? Like that's one of the big points here is that you're going to fail. It's going to undermine your credibility. There's a lot of reasons to say no, and to be very sober in your decision-making process here, because your goal is to be the person who has a reputation of follow through, delivering what they say they're going to do. And part of that is to say no to all the other things that you should say no to be a success in the things you've said yes to.
Yeah, it's a theme throughout the book that adversarial relationships are not necessarily a bad thing. I think about that a lot as a parent. I've got 4 kids, all boys, very young boys. It is their job to run around and try to break things. It is their job to try to eat 10 popsicles for lunch, right? Like that's part of their normal, healthy developmental pattern to find out where those boundaries are. But it's my job as a parent to push back. Neither of us is doing anything wrong here, but it's that adversarial relationship I have with my children that makes for a healthy, functioning dynamic. And he says something similar about managers and workers. He says, when your manager tells you that the login page has to be ready tomorrow, he is pursuing and defending one of his objectives. He's doing his jobs. If you know full well that getting the login page done by tomorrow is impossible, then you are not doing your job. If you say, okay, I'll try, the only way to do your job at that point is to say, no, that's impossible. Well, don't you have to do what your manager says? No, your manager is counting on you to defend your objectives as aggressively as he defends his. That's how the two of you are going to get the best possible outcome. And I love this framing that your objectives do not necessarily line up perfectly with your manager's objectives, and that your manager's objectives shouldn't subsume immediately any objectives you have for yourself. As professionals, our job is to create good quality software as quickly as we can. And in this scenario that he's talking about, having a login page done by tomorrow, that might be impossible. So giving your manager that false hope and saying, okay, I'll try, it's actually not helpful. It's not the kindest thing you can do. The kindest thing you can do is to defend your goals as aggressively as your manager defends his. And so you might look at that and say, okay, well, then my job is just to say no to my manager all the time. Also, no. Because as you are working to defend your goals, you also want to be creatively coming up with solutions to the actual problem at hand. So this is an example of how that back and forth might go with this login page. So Paula is who the software engineer is in this case. She says, Mike, I can give you a mock-up of the login page that will let you log in. I've got that working now. It won't actually check your username and password, and it won't email a forgotten password to you. It won't have the company news banner Times Squaring around the top of it, and the help button and hover text won't work. It won't store a cookie to remember you for next time, and it won't put any permission restrictions on you, but you'll be able to log in. Will that do? And in this context, the login page need to be ready for a client demo. So this is Paula recognizing the business objective that the client wants to see the login page and wants to have an idea of what it looks like, but that everything surrounding the login page can't be done. And this is perceptive on Paula's part because she's recognizing the real need here. The manager is just coming and saying, I need the login page done. We as software engineers understand all that comes with the login page. Like she says, the banner, Times Squaring, emailing forgotten passwords, storing it as a cookie. Of course, that can't all be done by tomorrow. But could the bare minimum functionality be done by tomorrow to make it look operational for a client? Nathan, have you ever been in a situation like this where deadlines have been approaching and you might have had to creatively come up with a solution to help bail your manager out?
I've worked in a lot of early stage startups, and I think this is one of the biggest things that we grapple with is fuzzy definitions, right? Fuzzy requirements, fuzzy definitions. If you let those sit, people will misinterpret, like, what is the definition of done? And he talks about this a lot here. Part of getting to yes or saying no is that, do we all really agree on what the definition of done? What is the login page ready for the demo mean? In a software engineer, I think a lot of times we have a tendency to catastrophize, meaning that we're like, login page being done. Well, there's like 50 things I have to think about. And the manager in this case probably just said, I need to show them that we're making progress. And I really just need to like have a login thing where the email confirmation comes up. That's all I really care about. Right. Or at least a mock of a page that says the email was sent. Right. Like that's all I really care about. And a lot of conflict to me comes from the fact that I misinterpret what the other person means. The other horrible side is I think all they really care about is the login with the mock confirmation. And they're like, no, we contractually promised them that we would deliver a fully functional service by this date. And I misunderstood, right? That's a much more situation. But yeah, what about yourself? I'd love to hear about your professional experience in this kind of area.
Yeah, it's not exactly in this kind of area, but he goes on to say, either at this part of the book or later in the book, talking about how it's okay to say no. It's okay to miss deadlines and to push things out, but it's not okay for that to be a surprise. If there are errors coming up, I mean, software engineering, we're going to talk about estimation later. With software engineering, it can be hard just by nature to know exactly when something is going to be done. It says that's okay, but you need to be communicating that early and often. And I've had that in my career several times. I remember in particular working at a cloud provider and having to do this big evacuation routine we had accidentally developed a circular dependency one of our sister teams had developed a circular dependency on themselves in conjunction with using our product, right? And so I had to orchestrate this big evacuation of their products to get rid of this circular dependency at this cloud provider. Uptime and availability was like the number one goal. We had to really do everything kind of under close guidance, close supervision. I had to draft a lot of particular documents called MCMs, model change management, that showed exactly what steps and CLI commands we're going to execute, what the criteria for successful execution was, what the rollback plan was, right? It takes a lot of time. And then you have to get these documents approved by like the sister team and a peer and your manager, and then like a senior technical leader, right? It was a lot.
Right.
So because I was relying on so many other people, the deadline was kind of a moving target. But that project really taught me that about active communication, that you need to be telling your manager, okay, I thought I was going to be able to evacuate this region today. I can't because I'm waiting on signatures from these people. But while they've been doing that, while I've been waiting on that, I prepared the next 3 model change management documents. I'm going to try to get them all signed off in one go. Yeah, that project was really interesting because from a technical perspective, it was really the surrounding context for it was very complicated, or at least in the weeds. But the actual execution of it wasn't crazy. It was really an exercise in like executive functioning and coordinating all these teams.
I'm in a similar situation with we're moving like edge compute resources, and I proposed thing in the technical implementation really isn't that difficult, but it's like, herding cats, like getting everyone to actually sign off and understand and agree what the implications are, what changes have to be made. This also reminds me of, in the fundamentals of software architecture, this is one of the fallacies, which is that it's that covering your assets piece, where you procrastinate on maybe some implementation details because you're not quite ready. And I think this is actually an interesting side of the agile methodology as well, right? Which is that you don't have a 12-month waterfall of everything that's going to be done. Sometimes you need to be moving back and forth as far as like what you're implementing, what's ready to ship. And this is a good reminder that you have to continuously negotiate what these definitions of done are, right? You might have said yes, then new information comes up, and then you realize I need to set expectations with my manager. Like, I realize that there's a lot more unknown unknowns in this than I assumed. And so therefore, my pessimistic estimate of this project is actually accurate, right? And so, yeah, it's a really interesting thing. And again, I think Uncle Bob gives us some really nice foundational principles to kind of fall back on when you feel like you maybe are getting confused, or that you're finding frustration in negotiating what work is actually on your plate or what's realistic, which I thought was really cool.
I agree. And that concept, we call it a company I was at, done. Like what, we, because we think, okay, the code is shipped, we're done. Are you really? Right. And at this cloud provider, we like done. I remember I had to ship a public facing feature, and my goodness, was that an insane amount of workload. Like I remember just writing it and thinking, my goodness, this would be a 2-week job at a startup. And it was like a 6-month process to get it out the door, to get something that, like, because I had to, we were responsible for the back end, but we didn't control the UI. And so I had to work with like the front end team on this, right? There were a million security reviews. There was legal. There was working with the professional document writers. There was, even at this cloud provider, since I was adding a new public facing feature, which modified the API contracts. It added some new optional fields, but still, that is a modification of the API contracts. And since that has to propagate across like HTTP requests, like the REST models, that has to propagate across our Java, Python, Go, Node SDKs, everything. So they had a whole internal process set up to do that population. But that was a big deal, I learned a lot. And you learn about, like managing software at scale is crazy complicated. But like working through all of the approvals and understanding that system, like that was crazy. And it was a frustrating process because every time you thought you were done, you realized there was another thing that needed to be done. Learned a lot about what does done mean, and it can be really helpful to have a document or something, just a full list of requirements for once we have done all these things, then we will be truly done. And
Yep.
if you have that North Star of what you're aiming towards, it's easier to say no to your manager. It's easier to push back on deadlines because you can take the whole of it in. If he says this needs to be done in a week, and you can look and say, okay, well, I might be able to have the code shipped in a week, but could I unit test it? Could I build integration tests for it? Could I, again, depending on the size of the company, could I have the UI portion done, working with the UI team done by that point? And that can help you kind of talk to your manager and say, I can't have it all done, but I can have these parts done, and then I can drive towards these parts. And I know that's scary hearing that because, like, yeah, saying no to your manager is a tough thing. This is obviously something that's easier once you're more senior in your career, but I do love Uncle Bob's take on it, which is this is what professionals do. Professionals don't work themselves to the bone because, you know, like you said, slaves can't say no. We can say no. Professionals don't give rosy, optimistic pictures of what might be because they're scared. No, we take
Yeah.
responsibility for our craft. We take responsibility for the deadlines. We take responsibility for the problem.
This is actually a really good segue into coding practices, which is something that we do. There's a big section of the book related to a lot of things around coding practices.
Absolutely.
And I think what ties into this too, if you think about this, and this is a big motivator for me, I want my boss to look good. And if I'm not being professional, it makes them look unprofessional. They go, because their boss is going to come to them and be like, why are you always missing your deadlines? You gave me this report. You said all these things are going to ship and things aren't shipping. And your boss can't trust you. You end up having these situations where you might start getting micromanaged or the teams get reshuffled. And those are all avoidable if you had the uncomfortable conversation up front instead of saying, you know what, I'll tell you what you want to hear. And then we'll never hit our deadlines, right? That's really the crux of what this professionalism piece is yeah. So,
well, and like you said, he talks about some coding practices that can help us feel more confident in the craft we're producing and feel more confident about moving faster and meeting those deadlines. We're going to be back with all of that and more right after this break. And we are back. Thank you so much for tuning in. Well, let's talk about coding practices, and let's start talking about something Nathan brought up at the beginning, which is the idea of flow. You might have referred to it as flow. You might have referred to it as being locked in. You might have referred to it as being in the zone. We've all been there as programmers. Uncle Bob makes a case for avoiding this zone, which I thought was fascinating. Here's how he describes it along with his description of the flow zone. Much has been written about the hyperproductive state known as flow. Some programmers call it the zone. Whatever it is called, you're probably familiar with it. It is the highly focused, tunnel vision state of consciousness that programmers can get into while they write code. In this state, they feel productive. In this state, they feel infallible. And so they desire to attain that state and often measure their self-worth by how much time they can spend there. Here's a little hint from someone who's been there and back. Avoid the zone. The state of consciousness is not really hyperproductive, and it is certainly not infallible. It's really just a mild meditative state in which certain rational faculties are diminished in favor of a sense of speed. Let me be clear about this. You will write more code in the zone. If you're practicing test-driven development, you will go around the red-green refactor loop more quickly, and you will feel a mild euphoria or sense of conquest. The problem is that you lose some of the big picture while you're in the zone, so you will likely make decisions that you will later have to go back and reverse. Code written in the zone may come out faster, but you'll be going back to visit it more. Nowadays, when I feel myself slipping into the zone, I walk away for a few minutes. I clear my head by answering a few emails or looking at some tweets. If it's close enough to noon, I'll break for a lunch. If I'm working on a team, I'll find a pair part. This is very much a contrarian take. Nathan, what did you think about this?
I'll be honest, I hate this. I think that flow state, sure. The one risk that you have is what they call clever code, right? This is where, and you've seen these, somebody's doing some like leak code level ternary operator mishmash that puts like what should be 15 lines of code and do like 1 line of code. Like, and you can do those things in flow state. Don't do that. Like, obviously, like there's a good assessment, but some of the best work I've ever done has come out of these deep flow state sessions. And I would imagine, I mean, again, you just look at the history of like prolific ideas that have been prototyped in weekends. Linus Torvalds was solving this problem for himself. Look at Ken Thompson, and the foundations of Unix was like the beginnings of that was built in 3 weeks when his child and his wife were out of town visiting family. You can't tell me that those weren't built in flow state. I would find that near impossible. I think it's who you are and what your personality is and the type of work you're doing. I also think that you should edit later. There's nothing wrong with going back and being like, what did I do in flow state here? Like, what was I doing? If we look at the Osterhout book, Philosophy of Software Design, he argues that you should design it twice. Well, it's amazing if one of those designs happened in flow state. And maybe you do a design in flow state and one that's not. I mean, that to me, it's a tool. I think that like shooting it down categorically as something that should be avoided is really odd to me. Maybe he got burned with some flow state hacky code and he, reached that conclusion. I've enjoyed flow state, and I know that when I find flow, I'm happier as a software engineer. Obviously you can't spend all day in it, but when you meet it, it's like when a writer talks about being visited by the muse, right? You have this like deep inspiration. And if you're driven with a very clear design thinking, I think flow is, the more time I spend in flow, the happier I am. I'll put it that way.
I'll give a defense of Uncle Bob's opinion here, or if not defense, I'm going to give some, what I think might be some context. So Uncle Bob mentions in the book, right, that he's only ever been drunk twice. I do not know if Uncle Bob at this point is abstains from alcohol, but at the very least, he doesn't seem to, indulge to the point of getting drunk, right? I feel kinship with Uncle Bob. I don't drink myself. Uncle Bob, I could tell. I think this book, like the idea of sobriety, almost like permeates the whole, the whole of it, right? He's very much about you are in control, you are responsible, you are a professional, and so I think. Like, again, I'm totally just drawing connections and I'm certain that I'm improperly psychoanalyzing Uncle Bob. But I see a through line there between sobriety and being against the flow, which is not, and again, I've been in the flow state before, and I think Uncle Bob takes it too far. I do see the parallels here. And that when you're in the flow state, you get, like he says, tunnel vision. You're too hyper focused on one task, and you kind of lose the inhibitions that naturally should be grounding you when you're writing software. I would agree with you, Nathan. I think this idea of avoid the flow state is impractical. One, I think it's impractical just because we're human beings, and like it can be hard to sit yourself down and make yourself write code sometimes, right? I know I don't show up for work every day raring to go. And so sometimes it can be really hard to actually get myself to produce. And so if you find yourself in a state where you are effortlessly producing, I think that's great. And you should do it. But I would agree with what you said, Nathan, which is that I think sometimes we as engineers assume that flow code is the best possible code ever written. I'm in the zone. I crank it out, and this is the pinnacle of code. But when we lose those inhibitions, we might make decisions that we wouldn't have if we were a little more, aware of our contextual surroundings. But the solution is just what you said, Nathan. Follow John Ousterhout's advice. Design it twice. Write flow code. And then don't assume this is the best code I've ever written. It's a work of art. Approach it again another time when you are a little more out of the flow zone. And I think I would say that's the better approach. Not always avoid flow, but maybe just be aware when you're in the flow zone of, let me revisit this later. It's totally possible the code you wrote is great and doesn't need any redesign. But it's just a good practice in general to design it twice. And so don't exempt flow
And I will
code from
say,
that.
you should always doubt your output, meaning that like I don't feel that my flow code is this like magical thing. You should go back and say, hey, and with a sober approach. And I think this, but this is the same way that like, so Stephen King wrote in this book on writing. He writes, I think 2,000 words a day or some crazy amount. He will write beginning to end his book or his manuscript, and then he puts it away for 6 weeks. And then he comes back and reads it fresh. And I think that's the beautiful relationship between flow state and that sober approach, is that there's this editor's mind. And he actually talks about this. And this is a cool thing of, he makes this argument that is against the one I'm making. And he says, he's a huge advocate for pair programming, also comes up in coding practices. And pair programming is something I've done very occasionally, and I wish I spent more time doing it. But he's like, pair programming is the antithesis to flow state. It's two people riffing ideas off of one another and producing output that's superior to the abilities of either one of them the first time. It also forces focus. You're not going to get as distracted because you're relying on this other person. I love that idea. And I think that there's something deeply collaborative and interesting in this counter argument here that, hey, look at this highly productive state you can be in. That's the antithesis to flow, that actually pairs up two people but gives more output than either one of them would have done on their own, is a very good argument here. And so again, I don't want to diminish the fact that brings a lot of wisdom here. And maybe in 15 years, I'll come back and be like, you know what? That was I was full of baloney, like I shouldn't have been, so gung-ho about flow state. I don't see that happening because I'm a huge like freeform creativity type of person. That's just my personality. But I appreciate the perspective. And I think that it's important for me to double down on why I think flow is valuable. I need to hear these counter arguments against them. I think otherwise, it's just a default argument on my side.
Absolutely. What do they say? Like, the mark of a intelligent mind is the ability to entertain an idea without accepting it.
Yep.
I think this podcast would be very concerning if we were just reading everything and saying, this is a great idea. Wait, no, now this is a good one too. And we were just immediately accepting everything we read in these books. We often disagree with the authors. But that perspective is valuable. Hey, one of our listeners who's good at making memes, I want you to make a meme of that scene in The Social Network where like Eduardo, Andrew Garfield's character, like comes storming into Facebook headquarters, and like Mark Zuckerberg is like typing on his laptop, and Sean Parker is like, he's locked in, and Eduardo's like, oh, he's locked in, huh? And he takes the laptop and smashes it. I want you to make that, but label Eduardo's character as Uncle Bob and right. Mark Zuckerberg as the flow zone. Well, let's talk about. Do you want to talk about?
I think the big one that you're interested in, like I saw your notes here, which is test-driven development. But as a segue into this, a lot of this, there's a lot of emphasis on pacing yourself, and I think that TDD is part of so pacing ourselves is this idea of like, well, how do I actually know how much work something is going to be? And he gives us a bunch of tools and very clear layout of, hey, you have to have these foundations in place before you can start doing this. So for instance, he talks about how he used to spend a ton of time debugging and that he spends 1/10 or 1/100th of the amount of time debugging as he used to, because he relies on tools like TDD or test-driven development. But the other ones I want to bring up briefly is honorable mentions before we get into TDD is time management and honesty. And he talks about like these patterns that we can slip into and ways to amend them on being late. Hope is not a strategy, right? I hope it's going to be done by this date. Well, that's a terrible way. That's a terrible way to operate. Rushing things. So the idea that like, okay, well, if I just like cut out these 3 or 4 things in my process, I can get it done, and then I'll look like a hero, and then everything's going to be awesome. And he gives really great examples of like, this never works out like you want it to. And I think from professional experience, it's absolutely true. You go back, and if you don't have to pay for it immediately with something embarrassing, you will pay for it in 6 months or a year when you go, oh, gosh, this thing keeps like breaking because I never did the integration test like I was supposed to. And now we found the edge case the customer did. Like, that's terrible over time. So he talks very clearly about, hey, sometimes you commit to something and the only way possible is to do overtime and you need to negotiate. You need to negotiate with your family. You need to be, if it's more than 2 weeks, you're going to burn out and, these things end. And then also like a false sense, a false sense of hope, right? Where you just kind of lie to yourself, right? These are all like the false delivery. I'm sorry. False delivery meaning you redefine definition of done to get it done.
His overtime was fascinating because he gave some requirements for like when you should agree to overtime. And it was something like, I think one of the rules was like 1, if your family's okay with it, 2, if it's 2 weeks or shorter, and 3, does your manager have a plan for if the overtime doesn't work? And he said, if you can't get these 3 things done, and I think it was those 3 things, we'd have to go check the book to be absolutely sure. But I remember that last one in particular, like then don't agree to the overtime. And kind of playing with this whole idea again of like sobriety, we talk about pacing yourself. He says like if you're panicking, if you're rushing, if you're scared, you're not producing the best code you can. This franticness, and again, he's very professional. He's Wayne Jarvis. He is a professional. He says this franticness is not how a professional behaves. Yeah, I thought it was fascinating. And he gives a very impassioned defense of test-driven development. If you are not familiar with what test-driven development is, it is the idea that you don't write any code before you write a unit test that tests the functionality of that code. So for example, let's say you need to write a feature on the, I don't know, you need to write a feature on the customer account class that is going to take all of the orders over the past 10 weeks and then return the sum total of them, something like that, right? He says before you start writing that code, you should write a unit test for it that evaluates that function and evaluates that it's correctly. And he says when you start writing that unit test, you'll probably be writing it for like non-existent methods. Like you might write the, customer dot get sum of past 10 weeks of order function, and your IDE is going to get mad at you because it's going to say, hey, that's not a function on this class. But that's the whole point. The test fails when you write it. It might not even compile. Then you write the functionality. He's really defensive and passionate of it. He says, yes, there have been lots of controversial blogs and articles written about test-driven development over the years, and there still are. In the earlier days, they were serious attempts at critique and understanding. Nowadays, however, they are just rants. The bottom line is that test-driven development works and everybody needs to get over it. I felt called out here because I've been skeptical of test-driven development for years. Nathan, what are your thoughts and philosophies on test-driven development, and maybe how did they change after reading this book?
Yeah, I think like a lot of things in this book, I take a nuanced approach. I will say the best code I've ever written, most reliable code I've ever written has really thorough test coverage very early in the process. To me, if you have very clear requirements, you really already understand how your class structures work, what the function signatures are, writing out, and those came from a specification document, and all great ideas to write out the spec before you actually write a single line of code. You have a very clear path to doing TDD, right? You know exactly what the API structure is going to be, what the function signatures are, and you absolutely should write failing tests that come out of that first, and then implement to it times. And maybe this is some flow state stuff. Sometimes you're kind of kicking the tires to figure out how you will structure stuff. And I do think that if you write the test first, this is kind of the antithesis to what came up in the philosophy of software design, which is that if you write a bunch of tests that cover these like 5-line functions, it makes it really cumbersome to refactor your code in a way that you're like, you know what, these should actually live together, or I'm actually going to like invisibly move things around. And so my nuanced approach is I try to have formal TDD structure to anything that's exported, anything that's externally facing, and give myself some leniency to internal functions for at least the early part of a development process. But then I try to, anywhere that hot code path happens, right? Anywhere that important logic is in place, you should strive to have full coverage. And again, this gets back into Martin Fowler's ideas in refactoring, is that you can't refactor with confidence unless you know that you're not putting side effects into the system. You can see where Uncle Bob and Martin Fowler share a lot of stuff here. And of course, the way that their programming style works is that they're constantly updating functions and contracts and stuff. But if you do that and you have a bunch of very like granular unit tests, you're also changing unit tests. And that's a really tricky place. I try to have unit tests that I should be able to refactor some code and not have to change the unit test. And if I have to change the unit test, I need to be careful because I might trick myself into thinking that all the tests are passing, but I actually changed the behavior of the function. And so, yeah, that's my like very long answer to TDD is a cool idea. I think if you have real clear purpose, you can't go wrong with it. Sometimes the formalism, you can get into this, I guess what Osterhaus calls the tactical tornado, which is that you write a lot of code that you feel like you're feeling really busy, but maybe taking a step back and doing a little design work should complement your TDD. But yeah.
Yeah, I wish I had more thoughts on it, like to be in my development career. I have always looked at it and thought, this is ridiculous. What are you talking about? I write the test first? That's insane. I write the code first. I'm a coder. I would push back a bit on this idea that if you're writing tests that are so fine-grained that when you refactor your code, you have to refactor the tests, I think Martin Fowler and Bob Martin would push back and say, yeah, that's the point. They say it's okay if you need to delete some tests. It's okay if you need to refactor your tests, right? That's the part of refactoring, and it's the price you pay for having high confidence that your code is working and that you can switch it around like that. I think a mental hump I need to get over, and I imagine I'm not alone in this, is I always feel like when I have to like dig into the unit test, like it's really cumbersome. Like the code can be manipulated easily and I can understand it and read through it. Then I get to the test and I'm like, oh gosh, it's like the neglected stepchild of any project. And anytime I'm in the unit test, I'm like, how can I get out of here as quickly as possible? How can I change as little as possible here? Because this is the test suite. This is what governs everything. I think Bob Martin and Martin Fowler and Kent Beck would encourage us to have less of a separation between the two. The unit tests are just as much a part of the project as the code. And I'd like to be better about that, about feeling like the unit tests can be swapped around more if they're not serving my purpose. Because ultimately the purpose of the unit tests in test-driven development, like Bob Martin talks about, is to give us a high confidence that our code is working. If it's not giving us that, why bother?
And I will say a nuance here is I am absolutely a huge fan of unit testing. Unit tests are incredibly important. And, in the Go community, a good example is, the testing suite is built into the language. There's a huge emphasis on high test coverage. And one of the things I really like, and this is in a lot of languages, is table-driven testing, right? Table-driven testing to me is a good example. You could write a test that says, multiply by 2. And you could have a single test case that multiplies a number times 2, and it comes back and is correct. And that would actually have 100% test coverage, right? It's probably like a one-liner. But, one of the things that's important about table-driven tests is that, or maybe we say, divide by n or something like this, and we run a few tests through it and it's fine, but we don't think about things like divide by 0, right? You need a table-driven test to think through a lot of test cases, and cases to me are much more important than like what number of lines of code are actually covered. There's lots of ways that you can like game the system. And I do think that like being as comfortable with your unit test as you are with your code base is a really healthy relationship. And that TDD encourages this. It says, hey, just like with like static typed programming languages, I have to think about the structure up front, right? I have to have my structs, I have to have my class structure, I have to have these things. And some programmers find it kind of annoying to think about all these type signatures. But I would say you benefit tremendously from that upfront thought. It's the same thing is true with unit tests, right? One of the things that you get for free with TDD is testable code. And I think that's one of those things that, you'll see, especially like junior devs, or even if you're just not careful, it's like, well, I'm going to pass in this database client. And instead of, and so you do all this stuff and you're always using the database client, and then you realize like, oh, I actually need a mock of the database client, or I need some sort of lightweight version of it so that I can like test these things. And so writing your code so it's mockable, right? Writing your code that you can swap out the distributed logger for something that is a good local dev logger, and using patterns like inversion of control or dependency injection. These are the kind of things that if you're doing TDD, these problems are solved up front. I have to go back and go, oh my gosh, this is untestable code, and so therefore I have to do a huge refactor. And so again, that's a huge win on the TDD side. Is think about its testability up front. Think about the social contracts or the export contracts that you have in place. And I love that. Again, if I spend a little time writing all my test stuff up front, I feel very confident in my code. And I think that's, nice.
Well, Uncle Bob says that the jury is in on test-driven development and that anyone who opposes it is a moron. So we might be morons, according to Uncle Bob. We love you, Uncle Bob. Come on the podcast. Prove us wrong.
I mean, again, it's funny. It's like I think this is one of those things where you're like, you should floss after brushing your teeth. Like I know that, and people who are diligent about not getting cavities always floss, but I don't always floss. And every dentist out there would probably be like horrified, but like it's something that I make sure that my daughter does all the time. And it's a good habit, and you should do it. And I feel like the same way about TDD.
Oh yeah, when my sons write code, I make sure that they do TDD. I don't do TDD, but when my 6-year-old is writing his code. Well, I have a feeling that TDD is going to be a recurring topic on this podcast, and our thoughts and opinions on it will evolve. We're not going to resolve everything about TDD within this one episode, but listeners, give us your thoughts on TDD. Let us know, is this something you've done and it's worked out well for you? Is this something you think is overkill? Like, honestly, this podcast could just turn into a test-driven development discussion podcast, and we could probably get a lot of good content out of it. But that's not the goal. The goal is to read the best technical books in the world. Well, we will take a quick break and be back with more right after this break. And we are back, wrapping up our thoughts on Uncle Bob's Clean Coder. This book really has so many great pieces to it. We always say we could do multiple episodes about pretty much every book we ever read. We always just scratch the surface on what is available in these books. We want to make sure before we leave that we talk about estimation. Uncle Bob has some interesting philosophies on how you estimate tasks and how you can estimate responsibly as a professional. Nathan, you liked this section. Why don't you give us your thoughts on it?
Yeah, I like this section because it was kind of like the medicine I needed to take, right? He speaks about commitment versus estimate and how there's typically a mismatch between management and software engineers, in that he basically makes the argument that if an engineer estimates the amount of time that something's going to take, leadership will typically take that as a commitment. You say, oh, it should take 5 days. And they go, cool, in 5 days, you're going to have this thing done, and I can go and they're going to create these big plans for the future. And that is a devastatingly bad thing if you aren't careful. He calls it the dangers of implied commitment. And so he really differentiates the idea of what a commitment is and what an estimate is. And he used a method that I had never heard of before. It's like an old US Navy operations manual called PERT, the Program Evaluation and Review Technique. It's from 1957. And he talks about how there's actually like a systematic statistical way of estimating with this sort of like, you give an optimistic estimate, a nominal one, a pessimistic one, and then there's a calculation where you can figure out what the standard deviation is, which is basically
give this calculation to your program managers. I'm like, yeah, I'm sure they'll run that, Uncle Bob.
So, and what's funny is that he gives this very like scientific thing, and I was like, I would love to play around with this because it's a really interesting way to think about like the larger your standard deviation is, the more uncertainty you have, and so therefore there's these things. But then he goes, okay, but mere mortals, like regular humans, there's like lots of other ways to do this. And one of the best tools that you have at your disposal is the group of people that you're building stuff with, right? You say, I think this will take 3 days. And then somebody in the group goes, no, you always say that it's going to take you 6 days, right? And then you negotiate the fact that all the things that could go wrong Or they come back and go, you should get this done in one day. Like Billy did this over here. Just like modify what they worked on, and you should be able to ship this, right? And there's this negotiation. And there's a lot of techniques, and I think if anybody who's on agile stuff, there's lots of tools. There's like estimation poker and a bunch of other things. He kind of goes over all of those, and if you've heard of them, you'll probably just be nodding your head. But the way that he frames it again was this idea that like a commitment is something that the business can rely on. And so we need to be very sober in what we're committing to, and very much differentiating that an estimation is a distribution. If everything goes well, it'll only take this much time. If everything goes wrong, it's over here. And then there's this bell curve in the middle of what it probably will take. And that you shouldn't make commitments on probablys, right? And that you need to have this sort of negotiated contingency plan, the backup, just like with the overtime conversation. It's like, okay, there's 3 pieces, like talking to your family, is it less than 2 weeks? And what's the contingency plan with management if this doesn't work out, right? And so anyway, that had a big impact on me. As towards the end of the book, he has some really great anecdotal stories, but I think we can segue into the end of the podcast with that kind of top of mind. But I'd love to hear if you have any thoughts on this as well.
Absolutely. I love his quote. He says, an estimate is a guess. No commitment is implied. No promise is made. Missing an estimate is not in any way dishonorable. I think there's a lot in this book. I found overlaps between this and the final section of Fundamentals of Software Architecture, which talks about how to communicate well. Because a lot of times when we as engineers give estimates to management, they're taking that as a commitment. And there's that fundamental mismatch. He talks about that in this book too. This is one of the things that I would really just encourage you to read the whole book. If you're listening and saying, well, wait a minute, the manager's in charge and I can't tell them this is just an estimate, it's not a commitment, because the book delves into a lot more specific advice and even has like kind of conversation scripts for how you can have those conversations. I think it's a good closing thought on the podcast as we move to our closing thoughts, which is just that professionals have high standards for themselves, and professionals have clout within the organization in the same way that you might imagine if a doctor, who's preparing to operate on a patient were to say, we need to move the surgery back 20 minutes because I am in traffic, or because I need to listen to this particular song because that's what gets me in the zone for the surgery. So we got to move it back 20 minutes. I don't know. I don't know how hospitals work, but if it were me, I'd be like, well, this is a surgeon. He's about to operate. He needs to listen to a song for 20 minutes. He does what he needs to do because he's a professional, right? We should strive to have the same sort of ethos with our profession, where if we say this is an estimate, it's not a commitment, we would hope we'd have the institutional clout where management would say, well, this is a professional. This is someone who knows what they're doing. If they're giving me an estimate and emphasizing it's not a commitment, I'm going to buy into that. But how do you become a professional? Well, I'd recommend you read this book and you follow all or most of the advice in here, because you can't just show up and have all the fun parts of being a professional and say no to your manager and push back on deadlines and redefine requirements and things like that without doing all of the other things that make you a professional, right? Are you meeting deadlines when they're important? Are you producing production ready code that doesn't fail? Are you showing up on time? Are you easy to talk to? All sorts of things like that. If ever there were a book, Nathan, that would prompt us to do something different in our career, I think it's this one. So we always like to close out the podcast with, what are you going to do differently in your career as a result of reading this book? What's your takeaway, Nathan?
Yeah, the estimate section struck me. I'm now in a tech lead role where I actually have a few engineers that, rely on me to help coordinate planning. And so this has actually gotten more interdimensional in that I'm not just estimating my own work. I actually have to make sure that the rest of our team is estimating work properly. And so I want to take some of the tools that are in the estimation section and see what we can do to become more professional in how we make estimates versus commitments. And and put that delineation there. And so that's what I'm going to be mindfully implementing over the next few weeks.
For me, it's test-driven development. Like I said, I've never given it a good faith effort. I have some data pipelines, which right now are written in Scala, running on Flink. I need to rewrite them in Kotlin and run them on Dataflow. It's a clean rewrite. It is a perfect candidate for doing some test-driven development. I'm going to do it, and I will report back on the podcast how it goes.
That sounds like a great way to experiment with TDD.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's what I love about reading all these books, right? Because we don't necessarily, like we said, we don't take everything from them. We probably forget more than we learn from these books, to be totally honest, just because we have a really fast reading pace. But we do get to experiment with these ideas, and we do get to just that constant exposure to new ideas and the constant long form exposure to them, where we're taking time and wrestling with them. Again, I've seen a million tweets about test driven development, but they're tweets, and so I just write them off and say, yeah, I'm not going to do that. But to see someone make an impassioned defense like it, or for it, in this book, it makes me say, you know what, Uncle Bob, you've had a lot of other great advice in this book. You feel this strongly about TDD, I'll give it a shot. So I don't know if I'm going to come away a big TDD convert, but I'm excited to try it. I think it'll be good.
Well, the worst case scenario, you write a lot more tests. So
yes, absolutely. Right. Okay. And we also like to close out the podcast with who we would recommend the book to. Nathan, who would you recommend read Clean Coder?
Yeah. I don't have a universal recommendation for Clean Coder, but it's if I saw someone struggling with one or more of the core topics here, especially if they felt like they weren't meeting their potential in professionalism, or they needed better time management, or they needed a good defense for test coverage for struggling in those areas, I would absolutely recommend this book. I think this, to me, is sort of like a good therapeutic book for someone who needs a little wake-up call for certain perspectives that they have.
Yeah, I felt the same way. If you never read it, I used to read a lot. I don't read as much these days, but I'm sure it's still great. There's a great blog called Ask a Manager, where it's like an advice column. People write into this woman who's a professional manager, just about kind of like workplace dynamics and office politics and things like that. But she is very much a professional, and she always has great advice. There was this one I read years ago, which really struck me, which is about how this woman worked in a really toxic environment where people are, just always mean to each other and childish and petty. Like, just, she talked about this one coworker who would like literally just stand in the doorway so she couldn't get through, like, to bother her. Insane stuff in a professional environment. She said that he was doing that once and like putting his arms out, and this lady, a professional educated lady, bit him. Like, she wrote in saying, I bit my coworker. Like, she bit him on the arm so he would get out of the doorway. And she's like, I feel mortified by this. But the manager, Allison, kind of wrote back and said, like, you are in an environment that has completely warped your idea of what office norms are. And you need to get out and you need to change something. Kind of saying, like, I don't blame you for biting this guy, but like, it's insane that you even got to this point. I kind of feel like if you are a programmer who's at that point in your career where like you are in such an unprofessional environment that you are thinking, whoa, something's got to change. I'm not being taken seriously. Read this book, because like I said at the beginning, it's aspirational in a way, and just realizing there's a way out. I think a lot of us wind up in companies and you assume that this is the only way a company could operate. This is a great, in similar way, you might wind up as who you are in your career and assume that's the only way you can be. And if you're looking to make a change, read this. Yeah. And I also wrote that I would recommend it to any junior engineers who know how to read something with a grain of salt. Because again, this is aspirational. It's a vision for what you could become. If you're a junior engineer, I would caution you against reading this and saying, this is the career ideal. This is exactly how I will behave myself. There is so much great stuff in this book, but it is just one vision of what a professional could be. But I do love the whole concept of this book that we should be professionals. That, I think, will absolutely stand the test of time.
Agreed.
Well, great. Thanks for tuning in, everyone. Like always, you can find us on Twitter at Book Overflow Pod. Find us on YouTube at Book Overflow Pod. If you want to engage with us, that's the best way, either in YouTube comments or tweeting at us. We monitor that stuff pretty faithfully. Nathan, as always, hosts his monthly podcast, Essentially Imperative, where he interviews interesting creatives. Please check that out. And also check out our interview with Mark Richards, which just went live. What is this? This goes live on Monday. So last Wednesday is when that should have gone live. Really fascinating interview, and we were so happy to talk with him. And yeah, like, subscribe, leave a comment, rate us 5 stars, follow us on your podcast player. Anything helps. We do appreciate it. And like always, we are just so excited by the response we've seen, and we are very optimistic about this podcast. We think big things are in store. Thanks for tuning in, folks, and you have a great day.